Donald Trump has taken his years-long fight to keep his taxes secret all the way to the Supreme Court today. This is a sign of just how far Donald Trump will go to hide evidence of his own finances. Now, some investigators say the records could reveal key information about his conduct, about whether he's lied about his money, and if he lied to the feds at any point in time, which is, of course, a crime. Now, House Democrats invoked one federal law to request the tax returns. Meanwhile, the Manhattan DA requesting records as they investigate potential local crimes related to the 2016 election, Stormy Daniels, all that stuff you may recall. So the Supreme Court could force the release of these records. Trump's lawyers have argued that lawmakers here have no legitimate legislative purpose in seeking them, and thus they're fighting the congressional request. Justice Kagan today suggested, though, the president cannot simply dictate how Congress performs its oversight of the president.
What it seems to me you're asking us to do is to put a kind of 10-ton weight on the scales between the president and Congress, and essentially to make it impossible for Congress to perform oversight and to carry out its functions where the president is concerned.
When Congress impeached President Trump, you may recall, we heard similar arguments, but the final word in that one rested with a Senate vote, a body controlled by the president's party. What's going on right now in Washington is totally different. An independent court will decide whether Trump wins or loses, or if there's some kind of legal middle ground compromise. And of course, in modern history, presidential candidates have typically shared a lot about their finances and taxes, even when they knew some of the stuff would look bad. That's why Kanye West could famously invoke Republican nominee Mitt Romney for clever tax dodging, saying, quote, "I'm just trying to protect my stacks. Mitt Romney don't pay no tax." Well, over several years, Donald Trump also paid no tax, according to an exhaustive New York Times report. But Donald Trump just attacked the Times over that and denied it, but never provided public proof. Meanwhile, there are other experts who stress that this type of secrecy leaves open questions about whether Donald Trump, as president, still owes foreign governments tons of money, which could compromise U.S. security. Let's be clear. This could actually turn out to be the biggest case on presidential secrecy and power of the whole Trump era, which is really saying something with implications for both Donald Trump and, yes, the presidency itself. Joining us now, we have two of our favorite legal eagles, the former acting Solicitor General of the United States, Neil Katyal, who's argued more than 40 cases before the court, although not by telephone conference call, as was done today, and Maya Wiley, former counsel to the mayor of New York City, a former civil prosecutor in the Southern District of New York. She knows her way around some of the New York legal issues that were part of today's case. Thanks to both of you. Neil, bottom line, based on what we heard, all caveats included, where do you see the court headed on this case? Could Trump lose?
Well, there are caveats because the justices today, like in every oral argument, are trying to just, probe both sides, the weaknesses and the contours of their position. So you can't always tell. Having said that, I thought there was incredible skepticism from both the left and the right of the court about President Trump's position, particularly when it came to the case from the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. That argument was, I think, brilliantly done by the Manhattan DA, and the Trump lawyers, frankly, fell apart. It was bombast. It was not actual much argument. They kept saying that this is unprecedented, but actually, going all the way back to the founding, starting with President Washington, all the way up to Nixon and Clinton and Billygate with President Carter, this information has been turned over. So I thought it was a very tough argument that Trump tried to advance through his lawyers, and one that ultimately I did think resonated with the court.
Very striking, because you're basically telling our viewers that based on your knowledge, caveats included, you see the Supreme Court heading towards ruling against Trump's secrecy here on his finances, which would be a big, big deal. Maya, I played a little bit of Justice Kagan. I want to play something else, which we don't usually hear, and that's Justice Clarence Thomas, both to reckon with that part of the case, what those justices were saying, and remind everyone that, we're in this pandemic era, and it has all sorts of odd outcomes. And Justice Thomas famously, lawyers know, but I think a lot of news viewers may know, spent years without ever speaking on the bench at all You get on a conference call, and apparently he's a little more comfortable. So here's something rare in the news. Justice Thomas discussing whether or not this could, if Trump loses, this kind of records request could debilitate a president. Take a look.
At some point, there's a straw that breaks the camel's back. And it seems as though you're saying that we should look at these in isolation as opposed to in the aggregate. Why wouldn't we look at all of them and look at the full effect and whether at some point it debilitates the president?
Maya?
Yeah, it was very interesting. Thomas actively participated. It wasn't just the one question. But this comment that seemed to suggest that somehow if the president does enough to call so much attention to himself and create so much legal concern that there's a lot of attention on him, that somehow that might make it too burdensome for him to actually address all the subpoenas. It's a little bit troubling because it's a little bit like saying, if you get yourself into a lot of trouble, you have more of an argument that you shouldn't have to answer for it. So I would be a little bit concerned about the line that I was hearing from Thomas there.
And real quick, do you think he's just more comfortable by phone?
It's the only thing I can think of because he is very comfortable. It's not just that he's participating. He really sounds at ease and he thanks people at the end after they've answered his questions. It's a pretty striking difference.
It's a whole different thing. Neil, you mentioned how some of the arguments in your view on the Trump side fell apart. I want to play some selections from Jay Sekulow. Longtime Beat viewers may recall. He's been on this show. And this is from different parts of the argument, to be clear, but gives people some flavor of what the president's lawyer was arguing and where there may have been some turbulence. Take a listen.
Criminal process targeting the president is a violation of the Constitution. This is a temporary immunity. This is for while the president's in office, and we think that is required by the Constitution.
It seems that you're asking for a broadness of immunity that Justice Thomas pointed out is nowhere in the Constitution.
Well, he's the president of the United States.
That presidents can't be treated just like an ordinary citizen, but it's also true, and indeed a fundamental precept of our constitutional order, that a president isn't above the law.
We're a long ways from Ukraine, Neil, and impeachment, but this back and forth did have echoes of some of the more extraordinary arguments that were offered on that Senate floor, that maybe we don't live in a lawful democracy at all.
Yeah, it's very interesting to hear Trump's lawyers, after all, Trump claims to be a textualist president who follows the Constitution as written, making up wholesale immunities that are nowhere in the Constitution, which is what I think you heard the justices saying. At the same time, Trump's argument is a fundamental betrayal of kind of the most core principle about American law, which is nobody is above the law. And that's what the Supreme Court said in the Paula Jones case in 1997. It's what they said unanimously in the Nixon tapes case in 1974. It's what Chief Justice Marshall said in the Aaron Burr trial in 1807. So President Trump's lawyers have this really tough burden of trying to basically say, oh, don't pay attention to any of that. All of that's wrong. This is somehow really different. And they just didn't make the case today. So I think, there may be some decisions around the edges in terms of Congress and how much they can subpoena and the like. But I think, the indications are today that President Trump has lost his ability to keep his financial returns fully private.
Very interesting. And so the last question I have for both of you is moving beyond all the law and all the constitutional details, with about 40 seconds left here briefly, what is, in your view, the potential benefit? What is the constructive outcome? If we learn, as Neil says, the Supreme Court may rule against Trump, that means that there's a majority in our system saying this stuff should get handed over. What is, in your view, potentially good about that? Neil and then Maya.
Truth, transparency, the American way. That's the way our country's been since at least 1807, or actually since 1792, and President Washington and the St. Clair thing. And, we shouldn't deviate from that. I mean, we as Americans have a fundamental right to expect this from our leaders.
I agree. It would send the message that a sitting United States president is not above the law and can't stop, hopefully Congress, because I do hope the Supreme Court recognizes congressional power here, but also a criminal investigation against many people. The subpoena said it was investigating, several different people and entities, that a president can't stop that because a president doesn't like the fact that it might uncover something about him that he doesn't like.
Copy. Both strong arguments there. Neil Kotshaw and Maya Wiley, thank you. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.